Hey everybody, this is Jake Tribbey from fantasypoints.com here to give you an early look at the week 16 DFS slate. We're going to talk some of the more obvious values and just some of the overall best plays for the upcoming main slate on Saturday, December 24th, Christmas Eve. Should be a fun slate filled with family and the holidays and all that good stuff. So getting right into quarterback, I think, there's a game in particular that really stands out to me, and it's Seattle against Kansas City. And, obviously Mahomes is a great play, but the guy that I'm looking at is actually Geno Smith. So Smith is the QB8 on the season by DraftKings scoring, ranking sixth in fantasy points per dropback, second in completion percentage over expectation, and third in passer rating. He's playing outstanding football for both Seattle and fantasy owners. And both groups are going to need a big game from Geno this weekend, given that a win for Seattle will push their playoff probability from 30% to 68% per 538. It's going to be an uphill battle for Smith and the Seahawks as 9.5 point underdogs, but that spread is also going to be conducive to Smith throwing a ton. And if there's a team to throw against, it's Kansas City. The Chiefs are allowing the second highest passer rating, fourth most fantasy points per dropback, and the fifth highest completion percentage over expectation. So I'd expect Geno Smith to be pretty chalky this week, but it's for good reason. He's a really strong play. There are a few other quarterbacks that I wanted to sort of like passively mention as guys I like. Daniel Jones, we're going to talk about a few of his receivers later, but this matchup against Minnesota is really strong. And obviously Justin Fields and a really fun matchup against Buffalo. I mean, we've seen what he's done on the ground lately. It's just been incredible. But let's move on to running back here. I think we all know who I'm going to talk about first. Derrick Henry against Houston. So since 2019, Derrick Henry has averaged an absurd 32.2 fantasy points per game and 195.6 rushing yards per game against the Houston Texans. If he played the Texans for all 17 games in a season and those averages held, Henry would rush for 3,325 yards and 31 touchdowns over the course of a full season. So, this is really just the perfect matchup for Henry. Now, I think it's fair to say, like, hey, opponent splits are really a small sample bias kind of thing. But I don't think that's necessarily the case with Houston. They're right there as the worst run defense in the NFL for seemingly the fifth year in a row, allowing the second most yards after contact, the fifth most yards before contact per attempt, the most missed tackles, and the most total rushing yards. It's a further boost to Henry that the Titans are 7-point favorites here, given that he's averaged 24.7 fantasy points per game in wins compared to just 13.9 fantasy points per game in losses. So this is really the perfect spot for Henry. He's been playing really well lately, and I'd expect him to easily be the highest owned running back of the Week 16 main slate. Another guy that I wanted to discuss was Ramondre Stevenson. So Stevenson came into week 15, fairly questionable and still ended up with 66% of snaps, 68% of backfield carries for 172 yards and 9.1 yards per carry and 59% of backfield routes. With an extra week of rest, he may get close to his previous role, which was, basically the highest end bell cow workload that saw him average 20.4 expected fantasy points per game, which would lead all non-Austin Eckler running backs over the full season. That was over his last 5 games. The matchup is tough. Cincinnati is the 10th toughest schedule adjusted matchup for opposing running backs since week 10. But the spread, the Bengals are favored by 4 points here, should mean the Patriots have to lean a little pass heavy, especially if they get down big. And Stevenson scored 46% of his fantasy points this season in the passing game. So if New England falls behind, Ramondre is going to rack up those targets and rack up those fantasy points. I think he should probably be priced at least at 8,000 on DraftKings. And, if he's too cheap, he's going to end up popping as a value. And I think he's a pretty strong play this week. Another guy that I really wanted to discuss here was Jerick McKinnon. So McKinnon is the is the RB2 over the last 3 weeks. He's a full-blown monopoly over the Chiefs' backfield pass catching role, earning 76% of backfield targets since week 10, good for 5.3 per game, which would rank 5th among all running backs over the full season. The argument against McKinnon this week is pretty simple. Isaiah Pacheco dominates backfield carries. He has 70% of the carries since week 10. And if the Chiefs blow out Seattle in this game, then Pacheco is probably going to end up earning the vast majority of backfield XFP, while McKinnon takes more of a back seat. And, the Chiefs are 9.5 point favorites. So that is a real risk here. But I think Seattle is a very capable team. They can definitely keep this close. And Kansas City has by far the highest pass rate over expectation. So even when they get ahead, they still tend to lean pass heavy. And when they throw, they want McKinnon in the game. Plus, this is a really strong matchup. Seattle is the single softest schedule adjusted matchup for opposing running backs. If the Seahawks can keep this game reasonable, I see no reason why McKinnon can't have another monster performance. And I mean, at 5,900, he's just simply too cheap. Um, so the last guy we wanted to talk about here was actually J.K. Dobbins. And look, I don't expect Dobbins to pop as a value. Like I think in almost every set of projections, he's not gonna look like a fantastic play. But since coming back from injury, J.K. Dobbins has had 56% of backfield carries, 50% of red zone carries, and 100% of goal line carries, averaging 8.8 yards per carry. So he's running really well, a lot of explosive runs in there. And we know who he is at this point. He's a hyper efficient running back who lacks a pass game role and offers a very mediocre snap share. So, like I said, he doesn't pop as an obvious play, but I think he has a lot of merit in tournaments, assuming we get low ownership here, because Atlanta is the league's premier run funnel since week 8, allowing a negative 11% pass rate over expectation. Combine that with Baltimore being 7-point favorites, and a run heavy game plan is all but guaranteed. And obviously, this game plan would center around Dobbins. Gus Edwards he still has a role. This is still a committee, but Dobbins is the main guy, and he's the guy they want to get the ball to. And he's ripped off 4 runs of 15 or more yards over his last 2 games, which actually leads the NFL, suggesting he has the big playability needed to post a tournament winning score. If Dobbins is going to be 3, 4, 5% owned, I like him a lot in tournaments. If he pushes for 10 or 15% ownership, I think I'm going to have to get off of him. But yeah, that sort of wraps up running back here. There are a lot of interesting options this week. But yeah, I think we're going to move on to wide receivers. So the first guy who really jumps out is DK Metcalf, and I think we all know why. I already covered that Kansas City is just a fantastic passing game matchup. Seattle's likely going to be playing from behind. And the icing on the cake here is that Tyler Lockett's out. Now, Lockett never misses games. So you don't really have a sample to say like, oh, this is what we can expect from Metcalf when Lockett doesn't play. But what we do have is a fantastic matchup, like I said, and almost certainly an extremely pass-heavy game script for Seattle. Metcalf's target floor this week could be double-digit targets because there's just such a big drop-off between Lockett and Metcalf and the Seattle wide receiver 3. I mean, Marquise Goodwin is a good player, but he doesn't really come close to the ability of Metcalf or Lockett. So, Lockett's leaving behind a 24% target share and 7.7 targets per game, and there's a decent chance a lot of that ends up going to Metcalf. So he's a great play. I'd expect him to get steamed. He should be pretty high owned, maybe the highest owned wide receiver of the week, and a really strong matchup. I also wanted to talk about Amari Cooper, who I'm not over the moon about, but I do think he's too cheap. He's at his cheapest price tag since week 6. He's been surprisingly quiet since Deshaun Watson took over as the Browns quarterback, and I think that mostly falls on Watson and not necessarily Cooper. Since Watson took over as the starter, he's averaging 189 passing yards per game and has thrown just 2 touchdowns. Granted, it's his first NFL action in 700 days, so he's probably a little rusty. After all, in 2020, he was PFF's 3rd highest graded passer, and he threw for 4,800 yards, which is 300 yards per game. Roughly a 60% improvement over what he's doing right now. If Watson can simply take a step forward, it's really hard to argue against Amari Cooper as a compelling play this week. The Saints are a neutral matchup in most of the pass defense metrics that matter to me, and Cooper is the cheapest he's been on DraftKings since week 6. He's notoriously crushed at home this season, averaging 20.3 fantasy points per game, compared to just 10.1 on the road. Again, though, this play hinges on Watson getting it together. If Watson keeps playing like he is, I think you're probably safe fading Cooper, but I'll definitely have some exposure here, given that Amari Cooper has shown upside, comparable to Jamar Chase at a price tag of just 5,600, which, like I said, is his cheapest price tag since week 6. But some of the guys that I'm really excited about are these New York Giants wide receivers. So Minnesota is far and away the single softest matchup, schedule adjusted, for outside wide receivers this season, plus 8.6 fantasy points per game. They've also allowed the 2nd most yards per attempt, the 5th highest completion percentage over expectation, and the 3rd most deep passing yards per game. They're a slightly below average matchup for opposing slots, which is why Richie James would be the clear number 3 option out of, Slayton, Hodges, and James, to me at least. But I think all three are in play, but specifically Slayton and Hodges. And the guy I actually like the most is Hodgins. Um, Hodgins is just $4,100 despite an 88% route share in his last three games. And over that stretch, he's earned 50% of New York's red zone targets and 100% of the team's end zone targets. He's just too cheap for a full time player with solid TD equity. Now, don't get me wrong, both him and Slayton are strong plays, but I think Hodgins in particular will really pop in a lot of projection systems. Yeah, just given his full time role, he's too cheap. The matchup is outstanding. New York should be playing from behind in this game, which will force him to throw. Obviously, we never know what we're getting out of Daniel Jones, but I'm willing to take some shots on these New York Giants wide receivers this week. All right, wrapping things up. Tight end, actually, I think there are a lot of compelling options, especially for tournaments. But the guy I wanted to cover was Travis Kelce. I think he's pretty easily the best option at tight end this week. He's going to get steamed, going to be very highly owned, but it's for great reason. He's priced as if he were the wide receiver 5, despite averaging 21.0 DraftKings fantasy points per game, a mark that's 7.8 fantasy points per game, or 60% better than the second most expensive slate eligible tight end, which would be Mark Andrews. This season, Kelce is responsible for the 3rd, 5th, 6th, 16th, 18th, and 19th highest scoring DraftKings performances by a tight end. He demands tournament exposure every week. And I mean, I'm sure you've played him every week, and especially recently, he hasn't had many monster games, but week 16 presents one of the best matchups he's had all season. Seattle is the 3rd softest schedule adjusted matchup for opposing tight ends, worth plus 3.7 fantasy points per game. If we added 3.7 fantasy points per game to Kelce's season long total, we would be looking at the 15th best fantasy season ever by a wide receiver or tight end. And he would rank first among all slate eligible players in fantasy points per game. So he's a smash play this week in the second highest total game of the slate. I think I'm going to be all over the Seattle Kansas City game. And obviously, Travis Kelce is going to be a huge part of that. All right, guys. Well, that's it for the Week 16 early look. Good luck making all your lineups this week, and hope everyone's excited for Christmas and has a great time building lineups and hanging out with family for the holidays.